Introductions. I mean, you all, obviously, you get it already. Without human rights education, how will citizens know what their human rights are, what their governments have obligated to providing, and how can we really engage deeply on these issues? Because as David also said, which I fully agree with, it isn't about spoon-feeding human rights. I mean, it's obviously challenging enough to familiarize ourselves and our students with the existence of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and some of the content, some of the very general ideas that were raised here. But we can't just do that either. And it's even just not about exposing violations and getting our students upset about them. No, it's really about understanding that human rights is evolving, that it's deep, that there are controversies around it. We shouldn't be afraid of that, you know, and we don't have to be human rights law experts to do that. You don't have to know all of this. It might be that the issue that is relevant for the class you teach, whether it's Darfur or it has to do with, I'm not sure what else all you're dealing with. I happen to speak to Alan a little bit, so I know what he's doing, but today we're going to hear more. Whatever area you're dealing with, you complicate it. Critical pedagogy is a catch term. If you all know about Paulo Freire, you know he was one of the progenitors, really, of the pedagogy that's associated with human rights education. We have to be keeping ourselves critical also about the human rights framework. That doesn't mean being negative about it. It just means not being afraid to ask the hard questions about it. We need to do that also when we teach. So I was really glad that point came up. And in terms of the human rights, one of the samples here is a document that was put out by the United Nations called The Right to Human Rights Education, because also implicit in what David said is, and it's actually written in clauses, I believe, in most of the treaties, there's a clause towards the end that says states are obligated to educate their citizens about the content of the treaty. So when states do sign and ratify treaties, they are obligated on paper to inform their citizens about it. And it's sort of like, well, why are we doing it then? Well, because it needs to be done. It's pretty important. But the UN has also been trying to accumulate documents that address this and really promote this from a legal point of view. It's under discussion now because this Declaration of Human Rights Education and Training is being written. And there is some still discussion about this. Is it really a right? Even if it's a derivative right, it's attached to the right to education. How much are states obliged to do this? And most of us who are doing it aren't working for the government. We're working for, well, schools, maybe public schools, but you're doing it usually out of your own interest, your own self-interest. It's not because your principal asked you to do it. Typically, it's not the case. But states, so what will it matter if we have a declaration? If states recognize that they have an obligation to support right to education, it means resources get opened up. It means it's much more widespread than it is now in the States and in other countries as well. It also means that when states report back to treaty bodies about the status of their respect for the human rights treaties that they've signed and ratified, which we're getting to now, the mechanisms, they include a piece on the education part. In other words, can it be the case that when our government, for example, sends in their reports to the treaty body for the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, that they also address the degree to which the U.S. government, through its state departments of education, are educating students about civil and political rights, or that it's included in teacher training, or that it's included in other kinds of trainings that happen with police or prison officials, wherever it's relevant. I'm just giving this example. It's not a very hard one. We've come quite a distance now internationally in terms of our collective experience and resources and understanding of methodology and so forth. We're working on the policy levels. Teacher training colleges are still very hard to address. But we've got some really nice examples where they're not only individual classes being offered on human rights education, but also kind of foundational themes that run through all of the foundational courses that teachers take in a pre-service setting. So there is progress, slowly. We'll look at some of the examples tomorrow. But I wanted to introduce you to another idea around human rights, which is going to be really played out a lot, especially when we talk about school-wide approaches, which has to do with just human rights principles. I think here's when we get human rights a bit more accessible too, in terms of systemic approaches and institutional approaches. So the standards, as you heard this morning, again, this is lingo, but it's, you know, there's just some language we have to get down. Standards, principles, mechanisms, just so we know what we're talking about, because it's easy to get confused. So this morning, we had something on legal principles established in binding treaties and covenants as constituting the standards, also known as the laws. Principles, the principles of human rights, have also been defined by the United Nations. These are equality and non-discrimination, participation and inclusion, and accountability and rule of law. These are cross-cutting principles that can be applied to ways classrooms are organized, schools are organized, development programs are organized, and this is part of what's called a human rights-based approach now, a big initiative. I mean, it's even more profound than initiative within the UN system. And I keep saying the UN system because we know we've been working around human rights as being promoted as a framework from the United Nations. Of course, the whole idea is that it doesn't stay there, or that it stays exclusively in law at the national level, but that it becomes part of public culture, right? That's what this education piece is about. It's not just about even accountability towards our governments. It's about a culture of human rights in our classrooms and schools, right? So here's where we start moving into cultural issues in terms of human rights practice. So here's the bridge. Now, so the human rights-based approach is a way of working now that has been promoted within the United Nations, and in particular in regards to development programming intended to reduce poverty. But it applies to all kinds of programming. And the idea is that all programming will be organized in terms of its conception and processes and implementation around principles like these. And I'm going to illustrate that a little bit for schools, but I just wanted to bridge right here that these principles are ways to begin to introduce human rights without referring only to the standards. A human rights-based approach includes reference to standards, but it also organizes work around these principles. So I just wanted to, let me see if, there we go. So back to human rights education. So human rights education was actually emphasized in the UDHR, also known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In the preamble, a common understanding of these rights and freedoms is of the greatest importance for the full realization of this pledge. So it's a kind of a general reference to human rights. And of course, what you can imagine is that we need to understand our human rights, and we need to educate in and for human rights. This is sort of the thesis of human rights education. It's probably familiar to all of you because you're here at this training. This is the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Here again, a reference to human rights education. Education shall strengthen the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Education shall enable all persons to participate effectively in a free society. So here again, we have general language. It's not called human rights education, but purposes of education around human rights education. But I think we can talk a little bit more. This is, again, thinking strategically in terms of the human rights movement, because I guess part of what we did this morning with you all is we sort of grounded you in international human rights and the human rights movement, right? Because human rights education, it's intrinsically valuable, you might argue, because it promotes human dignity in the classroom, it promotes inclusiveness, it's valuable to discuss, issues of international importance in the classroom so kids know more about international affairs. I mean, you can make these arguments, and you do, and we should, that make human rights education intrinsically interesting and important for students. And separate from that, we're in a Human Rights Watch setting. It's also part of the support for the international human rights movement, because we know part of what we want to do is really interest and engage and motivate students to care about human rights and to want to make a difference. And that's part of the agenda too. So what's the strategic connection between human rights education and the international human rights movement? I would say increased human rights awareness and practices among non-state actors, including members of the public, activists, political and cultural elites, I mean others as well, in order to increase pressure on state actors to respect human rights and promote the realization of human rights in everyday relationships among people. This part does not have to do with the state. One part has to do with the state and accountability, and the other part has to do with everyday relationships and human rights. So one part is the human rights movement and accountability, another part is basically in promoting a normative framework around human dignity. We're going to get back into this a little bit. Am I speaking too generally? I'm trying to bridge between the standards and culture in the classroom, because human rights education is partly about that. We've got different agendas with human rights education, but the strategic one has to do with civil society knowing human rights so that there's accountability towards government. And then there's other pieces that has to do with how we treat one another, how we set up norms of living together well and in full respect for each other's human dignity. So Pam had asked that we worked a little bit on a definition of human rights education. I think a useful way to try to begin to come up with an operational definition of human rights education is, first of all, to think about human rights education in terms of goals for wider society, which this one is, then goals for the education system in particular, and then specific goals for learners in terms of competencies. To me, those three levels work. So let's begin with the goals for wider society. This is what I'm proposing for you. You might not like it or feel it's incomplete, but I got this one adapted a bit from a Council of Europe charter framework. The Council of Europe is a regional human rights organ for Europe, and they're working actually on a charter that member states are very likely to sign on education for democratic citizenship and human rights education. Non-binding, but we had to work a bit on definitions that would be very concrete. So the goals for wider society, you could say, would be to contribute to the building and the defense of a universal culture of human rights with a view to the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms. A lot to unpack there, but this is the goal, you might say, for wider society, to build and defend a universal culture of human rights with these other elaborations. Now, what does this mean in terms of our educational system goals? It could be secondary schools, middle schools, university level. It means, and we're talking about formal schooling, to equip learners with knowledge, skills, and understanding, to mold their attitudes and behaviors, and to empower them to contribute to the building and defense of a universal culture of human rights. So the idea here is to build learner competencies around these wider social goals, around a universal culture of human rights. So in this culture, human rights would be understood, defended, and respected. So goals at the personal level, human rights education competencies, that's what we're going to address later today, because this is what it's all about as far as I'm concerned. Just so you know, although I certainly proselytize for human rights education, I'm a firm believer it depends on your learners, it depends on the situation, it depends on the classroom context, and sometimes the country context as well. I mean, in terms of the degree to which a human rights education approach is exactly the right fit. Like teaching human rights education, for example, in children in refugee camps, in a conflict situation, I'm not sure that's the right time for human rights education. People do try to do it, by the way. I've been asked to work with peace education people on how we can figure out a way that really works, but I've always felt like these people have just had their human rights violated. They probably don't need to hear what human rights are, because they're experiencing other things right now, and probably the other supports would be more beneficial to them. So it's all to say that I'm a real believer in you pick the right approach for your learners, for the classroom context, however you understand that. But but at the same time, there's something that human rights education offers that is not offered by traditional citizenship education, global education, or peace education, and what is that? But the human rights education is a movement, and it's has many related networks that have expanded exponentially since the early 1990s. History teachers, others, what happened in the 1990s internationally that might have ended the Cold War, also at the end of something else.
Peace benefit.
Apartheid.
Oh.
So what you had is a surge actually in the human rights movement, at least in Europe and in parts of Africa, and it regenerated a lot of things. It also generated a human rights education movement because it was the first time where we had systemic reforms at educational systems where human rights was infused as an alternative to Marxist-Leninism, as a substitute for apartheid policy. So there began really big thinking, not just civil society, but also system thinking about what human rights education could mean for schooling systems. Again, segue here, human rights education is not just schooling systems, it's also education and training for police, prison officials, social workers, health workers, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm focusing on schools, but it's for all sectors, right? It's all sectors. All right, so just to give you an idea, again, please don't take notes, just relax, but these are just some of the regional networks. Some of them are human rights networks with strong HRE elements. Others are exclusively human rights education networks. This is when they were established. Some are stronger than others. It's happening. Human rights education has become embedded one way or another in at least civil society, regional civil society movements, and there are also some international ones as well. What about schools? This is really old information, I'm sorry, but there's very little information that's been collected systematically on the presence of human rights education in schools. This is very minimal. This is UNESCO, the International Bureau of Education is with UNESCO. This is just looking at human rights as a phrase in syllabi. And this is 12 years old. And okay, statistics, it's higher now, but the point being that even if we don't know what's happening in classroom, and there's more scholarship coming out, it's showing up more. There are countries that have, especially in Eastern Europe, former USSR, where you're seeing human rights in syllabi. And there's much more. This is just a snippet, because there is more information available. In Latin America, a lot more. If anyone's interested in human rights education in schools in Latin America, the IIDH is the largest regional human rights group in Latin America, and they actually have the best research available on human rights education and syllabi in the whole region. I mean, in any region, but in Latin America in particular. It's in English and Spanish, and I can get to that information. Anyway, the World Program for Human Rights Education is a permanent program of the United Nations. It followed a decade for human rights education, which I know none of you knew about. That's fine. It's forgiven. The World Program for Human Rights Education started in 2006. The first phase, which we're concluding this year, was focusing on formal schooling sector. They identified 5 different elements or aspects of human rights education relevant for schooling, not just curriculum. And so this is the point of this slide here. First area, laws, policies, and guidelines that pertain or support human rights education in schools. The learning environments, including principles of inclusivity, learning tools, curricula, formal and non-formal, like extracurricular, evaluation and assessment, and that could be anything from learner assessment, it could be to teacher recertification, textbook analysis for human rights content, and then professional development. So there's a whole there are many elements that a system would have to take into consideration to really support human rights education. And in your binder, one of the resources is well, the short name for it is Compendium of Good Practice in Human Rights Education. It has 101 quote-unquote good practices in human rights education from Europe, from North America, and from Central Asia. This compendium is going to include core descriptions of these practices, and it's also going to include the actual practice or samples. If they were if they weren't in English, just excerpts were taken and translated into English. Just to give you an idea of what else is going on out there. So the World Program, all the UN agencies are behind this, and the second phase is now under discussion. What are they going to focus on? Are they going to focus on law enforcement personnel, higher education? What's going to happen next? So the last part here, because this is the last piece of input that you may not be able to exactly operationalize in your work, but this has to do with the human rights-based approach, and this is a lot. So maybe I should highlight a bit for you. The human rights-based approach, as I mentioned at the very beginning, incorporates the idea of the standards, but also these principles, the principles of equality and non-discrimination, participation and inclusion, and accountability and rule of law. But this is a really important development, the HRBA it's called, in the human rights field. And what's really exciting about it, I think it's exciting anyway, is that it tries to bridge the world between development and human rights. Because one way of thinking, someone presented this to me recently. I thought, oh, I guess that's kind of true. Way back when we had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then because of the Cold War and different priorities of different countries, we ended up with one convention or treaty on civil and political rights, and another one on economic, social, and cultural rights. So what's also happened is you've got development organizations often working on economic, social, and cultural rights, and then you've got other organizations, typically human rights groups, working on civil and political rights. And so the idea is to bring these worlds together once again by encouraging, in particular, development agencies and humanitarian agencies to incorporate human rights. One is the idea that you're looking at root causes of problems, so you're not just running in and building wells so that communities have clean water. As important as that is, it's involving the community in decision-making about setting their own priorities, for example. It's finding ways, empowering communities to take care of these problems themselves in the future. It has to do with analyzing who are rights holders and who are duty bearers, who's accountable. It has to do with looking, even in places where there's extreme poverty, actively seeking out the most vulnerable groups to ensure that their needs are met and that their voices are heard in terms of making decisions that affect their lives. And relating all kinds of development work and ways of trying to address poverty issues or health problems or child mortality or what have you in a human rights framework. So it's not seen as sort of charitable work, but again as helping rights holders to realize the rights that they are themselves owed. So there are ways in which it deepens development work. A lot of development work is unchanged, but does deepen in some ways. And if you bring a human rights-based approach also to schooling, it sort of changes a little bit of how you look at obligations of schools in regards to realizing children's learning. It's then seen as a child rights approach, as even a child-centered approach. Okay, so now we turn to schooling. End of story. Thanks.